Okay. Thank you very much. My name is Bob Perito. I'm the director of the Center for Security Sector Governance here at the United States Institute of Peace. I'd like to welcome you all this morning, and I'd like to welcome you to the USIP Center of Innovation for Security Sector Governance's third annual international conference. For the second year running, we are focusing on the issue of security sector reform in North Africa and the Middle East. Much has changed in the last year. Libya and Yemen have joined Tunisia and Egypt on the path toward democratic reform. Syria remains locked in an increasingly violent struggle. The security challenges and needed reforms vary by country, from establishing street-level security to reforming ministries. Yet across the region, transforming the mandate of security forces and their oversight bodies will be a critical element in determining whether the movement toward democracy succeeds. I'd like to begin this morning by introducing Dr. Richard Solomon, who is the president of the United States Institute of Peace. Under Ambassador Solomon's nearly 2 decades of leadership, the U.S. Institute of Peace has grown from a small organization in the National Restaurant Association building over on 17th Street to a global organization whose activities and achievements are commensurate with this amazing building that we work in. And so we are very honored today to have Dr. Solomon with us, and I'd like to invite him to the stage.
Good morning. I'm delighted to try to sprinkle a little holy water on what is really a very important example of the significant work that the Institute of Peace is undertaking with the exceptional leadership of colleagues like Bob Perito. Bob and I go back quite a few decades, actually, when he was on the China desk in the State Department. And he has had a series of remarkable assignments dealing with issues like police reform and other issues that feed right into the security sector governance issue. And so his leadership of this Center of Innovation is, again, a good example of where the Institute is doing some really remarkable work. Bob gave reference to our new building here, and the word building is important. Some folks like to talk about peacemaking. Others talk about conflict resolution, and I sort of discourage those words because they imply that you can reach a kind of stable endpoint in dealing with conflict situations, promoting reconciliation, and making peace. My view, and I don't think it's too cynical, is to say that we're always going to be dealing with conflict situations. It's just part of the aspects of being human and human societies. And our job is to try to develop ways of managing conflict and creating institutions, building the cultures and the institutional framework where conflicts can be managed without violence. And the challenges of that perspective, I think, have been highlighted just in the last year by the remarkable developments that are generally referred to as the Arab Spring or the Arab Awakening. Our country loves to see a good conflict, loves to see people mobilized to go after repressive authority, corruption, all the bad stuff that can generate real conflict. And what we saw in a range of countries in the Maghreb, even in Russia, where you get populations fed up with repressive, authoritarian, and corrupt government, overthrowing dictatorship, is really a remarkable set of developments. And why in the early 21st century we should see this phenomenon on a massive global scale is a very interesting question. Part of it undoubtedly is related to a remarkable technology. that we all probably have in our pockets, one place or another. I had a meeting a couple of days ago with some high school kids. I guess there were 40 or 50 in the room, and I asked the question, how many of you do not have a cell phone? And only one person in that room raised their hand and said she didn't have a cell phone. So this technology has given a voice to mass publics, and that's without question all to the good. But as we have seen, for example, when the hundreds of thousands of people have left Tahrir Square or other assembly points for mass opposition to repressive authoritarian governments, the question is what happens thereafter. And one of the lessons we've seen is that unless you have an institutional framework that will support the aspirations for clean government, for democracy, participatory politics, that the old institutions, particularly the mukhabarats, the security services, or the military, can reassert themselves in the absence of countervailing institutions. And so what we're looking at here today is the challenge of dealing with this problem of creating both a culture and an institutional framework to support democratic governments. And it requires at its core the reform or the creation of security services who will provide the stability, the personal security that will enable democratic government to take hold. And we're extremely fortunate to have here with us today what Bob characterized as regional representatives from many of the countries in North Africa and in the Middle East who have played an important leading role in trying to build momentum behind security sector reform. We're also very pleased to have a number of American ambassadors who have been in the middle of these dramatic developments in political change, and I won't introduce them individually, but Bob will be doing so as the morning proceeds. So I think your work here today is extremely important. It's very creative. It's something that has not normally been part of the agenda of our peace-building efforts, and we thank you all for coming. I understand that over 300 folks have signed up for today's conference, so I have no doubt it'll be a very lively, rich set of discussions. So thank you all for being with us. Let me just say also that we're much appreciative of the support that this day's event has gotten from the Department of Defense. So have a very good day. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Solomon. Now, I'd like to briefly go over our agenda for the morning. As you heard, we have two panels of distinguished experts with very different perspectives on events in the region. Our first panel is composed of representatives from Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, Yemen, and Syria. Our speakers were participants in the events that shaped the Arab Spring. They remain active in the struggle for democratic reform. I look forward to hearing their stories, and I'm sure you do as well. Our second panel features presentations by a group of distinguished American ambassadors who have served in the region as the United States ambassadors to a variety of countries. They bring a different and a policy-oriented perspective to our discussion this morning, and we're grateful that they have agreed to join us. And I'd like to join Dr. Solomon in thanking the Department of Defense for their contribution to this effort. Without their effort and their support, this would not be possible. So now let's get started. I'd like to introduce the members of our first panel in the order that they will speak. I'll invite them each to come to the podium. You have their biographies in your conference materials. so I will limit my introductions. Our first speaker is Radwan Masmoudi, who is the president of the Center for Islam and Democracy in Tunisia. I met Radwan in Tunis in January. He is a longtime advocate of religious tolerance and democracy in his country. We're very grateful that he is with us this morning. Our second speaker is Magda Boutros, the director of the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights. She was an active participant in the events of the Arab Spring in Cairo. She has concentrated her work in recent days on police and prison reform in Egypt. Our third speaker is Mouraf Joujadi, chairman of the National Consensus Movement and a member of the Syrian National Council. I've had the honor to work closely with Professor Joujadi over the last few months. He has emerged as a public spokesman for the Syrian opposition in the United States, and we're very grateful that he has been able to join us this morning. Our fourth speaker is Najla Emalgoush, a former member of the Public Engagement Unit of the National Transitional Council in Libya. She's a law professor and an activist. I've seen Najla in action in Libya, and I can tell you all, she is a motive force for change. And our first speaker is Rana Drum, a human rights activist from Yemen. Rana has worked with civil society groups and youth groups to promote women's rights and democratic reform, and we're grateful that she made it. She came probably the farthest distance of anyone this morning, and we're grateful that she's here. And we're particularly proud of our sixth speaker, who is Hisham Salam, who is a United States Institute of Peace Scholar this year. Hisham has spent the last year in Cairo observing events that shaped the Egyptian revolution, and actually, Hisham, your professors at Georgetown have asked me to ask you if you wouldn't mind spending a little bit more time in the library and less time in the square, because you have your dissertation to finish. Sorry, but anyway, I would like to begin, and so I would invite Radwan to start us off.
Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be back at USIP. The Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy has had a very long relationship with USIP, goes back almost 10 years. I remember our first event or joint event we did was in 2002. So a lot has happened in the last 10 years, and we really appreciate the collaboration and the support of USIP. I'll be speaking about Tunisia, of course, and although the center has been active in other countries of the MENA region, since January 14th, 2011, when former President Ben Ali fled the country, there has been a very lively debate in Tunisia about what to call what happened in Tunisia, whether to call it a revolution or not. And this is because revolutions typically are violent, are bloody, and very costly. They result in the removal of the entire regime and everybody who was involved with the old regime. And usually also after revolutions you have a period of chaos as you build a new system or a new regime. And this is why what happened in Tunisia did not really follow the model that people have or people expect of revolutions, that typically what happens after a revolution. So I personally like to call what happened in Tunisia and what is happening today in Tunisia a smart revolution. And by that I mean it's trying to balance between revolution and reform, between what typically revolutions, what happens in revolutions, which is you remove the old regime, but as I said, you create a lot of chaos and turbulence in the wake of revolutions, and that's why, again, revolutions are very costly, and people are afraid of revolutions. Reforms tend to take a lot more time and be more gradual and more slow, and that's why people prefer reforms. Unfortunately, as we know from Ben Ali and from other regimes, dictators do not want to implement reforms. They like to talk about reforms, but they don't want to implement reforms. I mean, none of this would have happened if Ben Ali or Mubarak implemented reforms 10 years ago or 20 years ago and acknowledged the right of the people of Tunisia or the right of the people of Egypt or other people in other countries, you know, to govern themselves, to choose their leaders, to hold them accountable, and all of that. So what's happening in Tunisia, I think, is a mixture between revolution and reform. As a result, only 15 people from the old regime are in jail today. Only 15 people from the entire old regime of Ben Ali are in jail today. This has allowed Tunisia to maintain an environment of peace and stability for the past year and a half. The best example that I have for this gradual reform in Tunisia, taking place in Tunisia today, is the case of Ali Al-Arayid, who is the Minister of Interior today. He's a former prisoner. He spent 20 years in jail under Ben Ali, 12 of those in solitary confinement, and yet he is the minister today of the Ministry of Interior, and he hasn't replaced or removed except maybe 2 or 3 people at the top of the ministry. So he's working with the same people who used to torture him, who used to torture thousands of people in Tunisia for the past 20 years. And he knows most of them. He knows many of them personally. Yet, you know, he told them from the beginning that he's trying to forgive and forget, you know, what happened in the past and try to build a new Tunisia in reconciliation with everybody who wants to also forgive and forget and contribute to building the new Tunisia. The biggest blessing that Tunisia has had, I think, I mean, there are many, many blessings that Tunisia had over the last couple of years, but the biggest one, in my opinion, is the Tunisian Army itself. Tunisian Army are a very professional, patriotic, clean, and nationalist army that historically has stayed out of politics. And this is extremely important in the context of the Middle East and North Africa. The Tunisian army historically has been trained to stay out of politics and to only defend the country and the security of the country without taking sides and without really being involved in politics. They are not allowed to vote in the elections, and they are not allowed to join members in political parties or anything like that. That is why they refused Ben Ali's order to shoot at people during the revolution, which has weakened Ben Ali, you know, in his last days. And also, we know now that Ben Ali gave the order to bomb the city of Kasserine with airplanes, and the military also refused those orders a few days before Ben Ali fled. As a result, the people of Tunisia really love and respect and admire the army, which has played a vital role in the success of the revolution and the transition. The situation in Tunisia, of course, is very, I mean, it's different with the Ministry of Interior, and it's much more complicated because the police forces typically have been very corrupt. They were used by Ben Ali to silence people, to torture people, to kill people. Most of them, and of course we should not generalize, you know, have been involved in supporting the regime of Ben Ali and in killing and torturing and arresting people for the last 23 years, and frankly, even before that, even under Bourguiba, the police forces were always used to silence people, to torture people. I remember myself, I was a high school student in 1981, and I was arrested in the Ministry of Interior for only 1 week. But for 1 week, I was hearing cries of torture coming from other rooms in the building for day and night, you know, from people within the Ministry of Interior. So, on one hand, you want to maintain the police forces in order to provide stability and security in the country, which is extremely important. You need the police forces, you need the police elements in the police to maintain peace and security and stability, especially after what happened in Libya, you know, next door where we had a lot of violence and turmoil and all that. It was critical to maintain the security on the border and not to let arms come in from Libya and stuff like that. So you need the police to provide security, but on the other hand, you want to clean up the police. You want to remove bad elements, and you want to train, the rest on how to behave as a Republican force, as a force that protects the Republic and protects the people and serve the people and also respect the laws of the country. So as we know, this is very, very difficult, especially because there are some police forces, as I said, who are still loyal to Ben Ali. I mean, there are many, many people in the police forces who are loyal to Ben Ali, and they are still in those positions of influence and power. And so Tunisians are constantly worried and afraid that these elements will be acting or planning for a counter-revolution, to fail or make fail, the transition to democracy and to bring back, either Ben Ali or his allies, from the old regime. So Tunisians are constantly worried and afraid that these security forces, who are still, as I said, mostly in power, are planning for a counter-revolution. This is also very difficult because at the same time, the people of Tunisia expect to see justice. There are many people who were killed during the revolution, but also before the revolution. There are many people who were tortured. There are many people who were kidnapped or raped and so on and so forth. And they, in many cases, they know the people who have tortured them or who have killed them or killed their sons and family members. And so there is an increasing demand in Tunisia today for justice. What do we want to see justice. We want to see those people held accountable for what they did. So this is the problem. And also they want to bring these people to justice, to the justice system, which of course raises another big issue, which is reforming the justice system itself, because the justice system also was involved in corruption and was involved in supporting Ben Ali, and there are many, many judges, not all, but many, many judges who were corrupt and were taking bribes and just following orders that were given to them by the Ben Ali and the former regime. So how to balance the need for justice with the need for peace and stability is the main question and the main challenge facing Tunisia today. This is what everybody is talking about in Tunisia today. That's why we have a new ministry for human rights and transitional justice. And this ministry has been focusing for the last 5 or 6 months entirely on the question of transitional justice. And how do we provide justice, but also build reconciliation in the country and a spirit of reconciliation. So there is no question that Tunisia will need a lot of help, will need a lot of support, will need a lot of assistance in this field, because it is a critical field that to make the transition succeed. In conclusion, I will say that it is vital and critical that Tunisia succeeds in the transition to democracy. It is vital for of course, it's vital for the people of Tunisia, but I think it is also vital for the region. It is vital for the interests of the United States, of Europe, and of world peace in general. So this is not easy, as you know. Transitions to democracy from a dictatorship is very, very difficult. You have to build new institutions, you have to build new culture, you have to build new laws, and so on. So it takes time, and it's very difficult. But failure in Tunisia should not and is not an option, because it will be a disaster, not only for Tunisia, but for the entire region. This is why Tunisia needs the support of the United States, of Europe, and of the whole international community to put all its weight and all its support, moral, political, as well as economic, behind Tunisia to make sure that the transition to democracy succeeds in Tunisia. Frankly, so far, Tunisia has heard and received a lot of promises of support and a lot of goodwill from the international community, but very little has actually come forward and actually been delivered from this support and from this assistance. Especially, I would like to emphasize the need for economic assistance, because what caused the revolution was the terrible economic situation and social situation in the interior of the country. This is why we have hundreds of thousands of youth, unemployed youth, educated youth who revolted and who frankly are still revolting because they want to see improvements in their lives. And unless we can stabilize the economic situation and give people hope, especially in these areas, to be patient, to be a little bit more patient and give time to this transitional process to take place, then there is risk that the situation will get out of hand and the transition will be in trouble. Anyways, I look forward to the Q&A period, and thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Magda Boutros. I come from Egypt, and I would just like to correct that I'm not the director of the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights. I'm the director of the Criminal Justice Unit within the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights, which is an Egyptian human rights organization using research, advocacy, and litigation. Under Mubarak, the Egyptian state was a police state in the sense that security agencies held more powers than elected institutions and were involved in all matters of public life, from education to business to religion. And this security state is what the Egyptian people raised up against on the 25th of January in 2011. The 25th of January is the day that used to celebrate Police Day, and it's no coincidence that this is the day that revolutionaries chose to start their revolution. And the security state is also what the Egyptian people have been struggling to disband since then. We can broadly say the security state can be broken down into three categories: the police, the army, and the intelligence agencies. And the main problem that we are facing now in Egypt is to make these security agencies accountable, when traditionally there was no accountability, and to limit their role to security matters. I'll try to go through each of those, the police, the army, and the intelligence services very briefly, and explain their state and the challenges that we're facing now. The police, the main problem is for the people to start feeling security again, to restore street-level security, and at the same time to create oversight mechanisms. Like in Tunisia, the Egyptian police has a history of violence, of injustice, of fabricating cases against innocent people, and of torture. 3 days into the uprising on 28th of January, the police completely withdrew after hours of battle with the revolutionaries. In a few hours, there was no police officer to be seen anywhere in the country. Up to 150 police stations were burned down, and we didn't see the police until Mubarak stepped down. They started gradually taking their role back. A year and a half later, feelings of insecurity keep increasing. People have a sense that crime rates keep increasing, that the police are still not doing their work, that the police are still not securing the streets. The main obstacle to reform has been the persistent refusal of successive governments to start reforming the police. Despite early promises that there will be no coming back to the past, changing the slogan of the police, changing a few names, we haven't seen any real change. And not only this, we have also documented an increase in the violence used by the police, whether in the dispersing demonstrations, in using tear gas, using less than lethal weapons, using live ammunition against unarmed protesters. But we also have documented the increased use of force in law enforcement activities and in other police activities. I would identify two main actors pushing for reform, for police reform. The first is civil society. I'm part of a group of activists and police officers and former police officers who got together last May and have been developing a comprehensive vision for police reform. We have had meetings with political parties, with civil movements. We've presented our ideas in the media. And since the parliament took office, we have had meetings with the National Security Committee within the parliament. And we presented our ideas to them in a draft law that would create clear provisions on police powers and that would create the oversight mechanisms necessary over the police. and also create mechanisms for carrying out a non-partisan reform process. I'm very proud to say that this draft law has made its way into Parliament and is currently being discussed within Parliament as the law on police reform. Of course, the bill has been strongly rejected by the ministry. I was just reading yesterday in the papers that the ministry made a statement saying that the proposal to create an oversight mechanism over the police is useless. Another important actor that is pushing towards reform are the lower-ranking police officers. Here I'm talking about both conscripts who are enrolled to spend their military service in the police force and non-ranked police officers who do the bulk of policing work. They have appalling working conditions, very long hours, very low wages, and they are subjected to military trials for any disciplinary offense. This means that they can go to prison for any disciplinary offense. Since the stepping down of Mubarak, they have been demanding better conditions of employment. And while they were offered a pay raise, the continuation of their very unfair treatment by higher-ranking police officers or by the leadership of the ministry has led them to go on striking and to raise their demands to what they call a purification of the ministry, the resignation of the current Ministry of Interior, and the appointment of a civilian minister, somebody from outside of the police force. To give you an example, the latest of these strikes was organized last week by conscripts who were protesting against the killing of one of their colleagues by a police officer. This time, the Ministry of Interior got the army to disperse their demonstration, but the ministry is feeling increasingly the pressure to respond to their demands. And it has recently sent to Parliament 3 amendments to the police law that would partially respond to the demands of the lower-ranking police officers. Now to the second agency, the army. Of course, the army is the most complicated agency, and I'll try to be very brief, although it's a very big topic. On the 11th of February, when Mubarak stepped down, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, what we call the SCAF, has, for the first time, been in the face of power. I could say publicly holding power. They were steering power for 60 years before, but this was the first time they were actually the ones publicly in power. And of course, this came with a share of public criticism of their way of handling the transition. Now they seem to be wanting to hand over to an elected president. However, they want to safeguard important privileges. The first one is their economic interests. The army in Egypt has been doing business without being subjected to either oversight, taxation laws, or competition laws. And the second one is to keep a grip on what they consider national security matters. Companies held by the army produce everything from tanks and weapons to pasta and mineral water. And they have traditionally been working without being subject to any oversight, and they have been operating outside of the law. Preserving these interests and these privileges are at the core of their negotiations with the political parties. However, this is not the only problematic issue. Their insistence on keeping a grip on matters that they consider national security is also something that we see as activists problematic. It can mean that many internal security matters or justice matters will be kept in the hands of the military without any oversight or accountability. To just give you an example of something that just happened last week, in Abbasiyya Square, close to the Ministry of Defense, for 4 days, protesters held a sit-in in front of the Ministry of Defense. Every single night for 4 nights, they were attacked by people wearing civilian clothes, while the army just stood by and did not intervene. The police were not even present. On the 4th day, the clashes started becoming more brutal, and at least 11 people died. It's not before the 5th day that the army stepped in and the attackers suddenly disappeared. 2 days later, large demonstrations in solidarity with the Abbasiyya demonstrators came and stood in front of the Ministry of Defense. Again, violence erupted between the army and the protesters, and it resulted in dozens of injuries and over 350 arrests. The army arrested protesters, arrested field doctors, arrested journalists. All of those who were arrested were referred to military prosecution with charges of assaulting military officers or being present in a military area. This was in the street. All these civilians are now being interrogated by the military prosecution and will be referred for conviction to the military courts. These will be added to more than 12,000 civilians who have been tried in military courts since Mubarak stepped down. The SCAF has been very fierce in defending this right to be the sole authority competent to judge and investigate any crime that they consider related to their interest, to what they call national security. But this includes the security of the army, of its personnel, of its companies, of its secrets. They even have competence to try children in military courts. And to give you an idea of the power balance between the SCAF and the elected parliament now, only one day after the 350 arrests happened, the parliament passed an amendment to the law on military justice. This amendment removed the power of the President of the Republic to refer civilians to military courts. However, it kept intact the power of the military justice to deal with civilians who commit crimes in military-controlled areas, against the military institution, against its companies, against its secrets, and many other competences. And lastly, the intelligence services. The two issues we're facing in the intelligence services are to limit their role to intelligence work and create oversight mechanisms again. We have three main intelligence agencies in Egypt: the General Intelligence Agency, the State Security Agency, which has now changed its name to Homeland Security Agency, and the Military Intelligence. In practice, the intelligence agencies have also been responsible to matters that are not related to intelligence. For example, sensitive foreign affairs matters have traditionally been sole responsibility of the general intelligence, the mukhabarat. Matters related to Palestine, to Israel, to Sinai, to the Nile water were all completely dealt with by the mukhabarat. Another thing that the intelligence services used to be involved in is providing security clearances for all major positions in the countries. This means that they could approve or block any appointment to positions of ministers and governors, but also to university deans, teachers, and judges. Limiting the role of the intelligence services to intelligence work is one of the challenges we're now facing. Another problem with the intelligence agencies is the total lack of transparency on the way they work, total lack of transparency on their budget, on the activities they carry out, and an absence of judicial oversight of their activities. This is so despite them having by law very wide powers to obtain information on public institutions and on individuals, to detain people, to arrest people, and to interrogate people. The General Intelligence Agency has a dark history of torture and enforced disappearance, in particular in cooperation with the US rendition program. The State Security Agency also has a track record of oppressing political dissent using torture, detention without charge or trial, sometimes for up to 14 years, and arbitrary arrests. In conclusion, I would say that the security sector should be priority number one right now in Egypt, if we are serious about the transition to democracy. Efforts should focus on making security agencies accountable, on making transparent decision-making in security agencies, and judicial oversight. If we don't get rid of the state of exceptionality enjoyed by security agencies, whether the army, intelligence services, or the police in Egypt, we won't be serious about democratic transition.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Special thanks to the U.S. Institute of Peace. This is the second time that I speak in this august auditorium. The first time was the first official act of the Syrian National Council. And so I can say that the U.S. Institute of Peace is truly a friend of the Syrian people. I also would like to say Mabruk to my fellow panelists on their revolutions. Your societies are still going through some painful moments, but at least you have gotten rid of those regimes. We hope to emulate you very soon, inshallah. Our priority, of course, is the collapse of the Assad regime and the establishment of a free and democratic Syria. But in the immediate future, the priority is the need to stop the bloodletting. I didn't myself hear it on the news this morning, but some colleagues told me apparently that there was a massive bomb in Damascus this morning in the downtown killing at least 50 people. Now, these 50 people who have been killed are other than the tens of people that are going to be killed by the security forces today. I say that because we have had precedents for the past 14 months. This is the nature of the beast that we are dealing with. There are many, many challenges for the Syrian revolution. We have no illusions. There are many challenges, and the day after the collapse of the Assad regime, which we hope would be very soon, I think our first and foremost challenge is to secure the stocks of weapons of mass destruction that are now at the disposal of the security forces, lest they fall in the wrong hands and they would have not only devastating domestic implications, but also regionally as well. What is remarkable, hearing my colleagues here, in Washington we always say that each revolution in each of these different states is different, but there are so many similarities. My God, it's almost a carbon copy, what I have heard from my Tunisian friend, from my Egyptian colleague, and surely what I'm going to hear from my Yemeni friends as well. Certainly, these different revolutions have their own specificities, but truly there are many common denominators. What sets Syria apart from the rest probably is the sectarianism that is at play, the fact that the army in Syria, unlike the army in Tunisia, which has been traditionally semi-autonomous of political power, and unlike the same situation in Egypt, whereby the army whispered into the leaders' ears to please go away. In Syria, the Assad regime holds the crucial threads of power, and one of them is this army. And that is done through the sectarian nature of the regime and by putting family and friends in the more strategic areas of the army. What we will worry about the day after the collapse of the Assad regime is not only to secure those weapons of mass destruction, but generally a need to watch for the remnants of the regime, because remnants of the regime are going to want to make the point that under Assad there was stability and after Assad there is no stability, and they will try as best as they can to create as much chaos as they can through IEDs, through car bombs, through assassinations. I am thinking not only of Ba'ath Party militias, not only of what are called popular organization militias, but of the Shabbihas. The Shabbihas are death squads. You cannot give them really another name. They make the Baltajia in Egypt, they make them look like Mother Teresa's. This is how bad the situation is with the Shabbihas. There will be other remnants of the regime who will try to make a comeback. I am thinking of elements in the 4th Division of the Army and of the Republican Guard. But other than the remnants of the regime, I think what is to be feared is the general looting. And here it's not only looting for looting's sake, but you do have a population that has become so frustrated with this Ba'ath Party and the Mukhabarat and so on and so forth, that there will be, I think, popular attacks against all the buildings of these institutions. There will be a lot of opportunism with places, with cultural centers. As you know, Syria is almost an open-air museum. It has been crossed by many civilizations, and you have many dead cities, and so there will be many opportunists who try to get a piece of the pie in order to sell these things illegally. So I predict, in short, a lot of chaos after the fall of the collapse of the regime, and luckily the opposition movement, as I speak, is putting together a plan for the day after the collapse in order to minimize as much as possible the violence that could take place. There is another problem that is equally daunting, but probably of another nature, and that is with regard to the transformation of the security forces. What Syrians want is a small, professional, disciplined, apolitical army, one that accepts civilian authority. one that emerges from its democratic milieu, one that is, whose function is to safeguard the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of Syria, as opposed to what we have now. And what we have now, of course, is the army that is ruling, the army/mukhabarat apparatus. And the difficulty is not only in the physical transformation, but it is in the transformation of the mindset. The army and the mukhabarat, of course, have been in power since the 1960s, and the culture, the political culture of Syria is an authoritarian political culture in which most people have come to believe that the relationship between state and society should be based on fear, that the state should deter society, that society should not participate in politics, that this is the stuff of the elites. And so it is that mindset that is going to be very, very difficult to change. Now, scenario, the Assad regime collapses, we take out the bad apples from the senior ranks of the army, we put in some good folks, the treasury is held by parliament. That is all nice and well, but what would prevent, based on this authoritarian culture, what would prevent a coup that would take the central bank and the democratic parliament and so on? And so there is really a long way and a process of re-education, because, as you know, old habits die hard. And this is going to be a very, very daunting task. Finally, and as we have learned lessons from fellow Arab states, one worry is about the Free Syrian Army. The Free Syrian Army, which you know is the outcome of the defection of soldiers who have refused orders to shoot at fellow Syrians, at civilians. But the Free Syria Army has truly very little command and control, and the Free Syrian Army is in disparate locations throughout Syria, and that reminds me very much of the situation of the rebels, the revolutionaries in Libya. And so it's going to be difficult after the Free Syrian Army has been given the task to police and to try to prevent the chaos that I was describing earlier. It might be a difficult task to try to reintegrate those folks into the national police force and into the national army that we propose to reconstruct, because many of these would want a piece of the pie and might resist this reintegration lest they get what they want. This, I think, is the situation in Libya as I see it, and my friend will correct me. Now, these are huge obstacles. These are huge challenges, and again, we have no illusions. Some days I throw my hands down and I want to give up and I want to go to my backyard and plant my petunias instead. But then when I hear the news and I hear that another 50 or 60 or 70 people have been shot and murdered by the security forces, this re-energizes me. And it re-energizes the entire Syrian population. There is simply no going back. A people that have revolted for 14 months in the face of the lethality and the brutality of this regime will not give up. The people of Syria have spoken, and what they want is the downfall of the regime. And now they are calling for the execution of the president. The barrier of fear in Syria has broken, so it is only a question of time before the Assad regime collapses. And the Syrian people have shown a courage and a bravery, I think, that is unprecedented in history. But alone they cannot do it, and they need the help of the international community. Like the Tunisian case, we have heard a lot of great, sweet talk. And we thank everybody for their sympathy. But sympathy alone is not going to help us make the Assad regime collapse. And together, in the case and in the cause of humanity, the Syrian people seek your help. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm glad and honored to be among you today. And this is my first time in America and Washington. Thank you for being here, and thank you for the United States Institute of Peace to give me this opportunity to be among you and to share with you my experience and to listen to your intervention and question which I will definitely benefit from. I speak today about my country, Libya, that suffered from a long period of dictatorship. I will also speak about my Libyan revolution and about security in Libya from the Libyan perspective. Finally, I will talk about efforts that have been made by both the Ministry of Defense and Ministry of Interior to maintain security in the transitional period. The revolution and what happened in Libya for me was a big dream that I never dared to dream about it because we lived in dictatorship and we suffered from many injustices. This made us put aside the idea that any chance was possible. Even then we saw the Tunisian revolution and what happened in Egypt. We prayed for our brothers and we support them, but that was the best we could. We never thought it could happen in Libya. But what happened in Libya on the 15th of February 2011 was the spark that lit the fire of the revolution. When the lawyer Fathi Terbil was arrested by a security officer, a number of protests stood in front of the Central Security Building in Benghazi objecting this action. And the name of the 17th February 2011, when a number of protests occurred in Benghazi because the number of casualties exacted for 100 people between death and injury by security and mercenaries brought from the board. On the 20th of February, the Fadil Bouammar military barracks was brought down in the city of Benghazi, which was a symbol of Gaddafi regime. By doing this, the impossible happened for the people of Benghazi. From that date, I decided to join to my friends in the court. I decided to go out no matter what the price was. I felt an unusual power and an ephemeral determination. And even with the concern of my small family, I didn't think twice. All I wanted at that moment was to do something for my country. As soon as I reached the door of the court, I found people protesting in front of the building. I stood with them and we demanded to bring down the regime. Some people covered their faces. They are afraid somebody see them, and others did not care. After that, I knocked the door of the court to step inside the world full of legal professional, lawyer, prosecutor, and judge that gathered around one goal, and they were few because the element of trust is what mattered at that point. As soon as they saw me, they welcomed me, and that was the beginning of the road. We found ourselves working from 8 a.m. till the mid of the night with enthusiasm and without having a clear vision or our plan. What we had was the will to continue till the end. I started writing leaflets and posters to cheer up the people because we started something and we need to finish it. After that, a few of my friends and I went to Benghazi local radio station to gain control over it. We used it to communicate with the people in Libya. And the action carried a huge risk because Benghazi was very insecure and the station was outside the city. But we didn't think twice. We started protesting. It was a historic moment when the phrase of Free Libya was said in the radio. I was the first woman to read the name of the revolution and to talk about being peaceful revolution. The people's revolution against injustice and saying that everyone should support us with everything they have. And we asked everyone to do their patriotic duty and give up the weapons that have been taken from the barracks so they could be used in the revolution. That we took steps to protect the foreigners that were in the city and give them all the support and help we could because most of them did not know what was the situation. We divide ourselves in groups and whatever spoke English were picked, and so we did help the foreigners to leave via Benghazi port, and that port was gathered and guarded by a group of volunteers day and night. We arranged for ships to help them leave and give them food and other supplies. After that, the NTC decided to form a media committee of their own, and I was voted head of public engagement unit, where it was a terrific and amazing experience, which impacted deeply in my life. The public engagement conducted a series of seminars on different topics. First, challenge to build democracy state in Libya In that series, 4 seminars were held to introduce the NTC member to the public. In addition, the BAU team organized a gathering and workshops for the NGO that received acceptance from the NTC. And this gathering resulted in the first needs assessment of civil society in Libya. In the next phase, I started working with the United States Institute of Peace on the ground in Libya, and as a program specialist, and this happened when I met Mrs. Manal Omar, the regional director of North Africa program at USIP, when she came for the visit in Benghazi for the first time during the revolution. Manal and I have held and organized many workshops and events in the ground in Libya, especially in the conflict resolution workshop and also the transitional justice. The security in Libya. I will talk now about the current security state in Libya from the Libyan citizen perspective. I'm not expert in this field, but to analyze the security state and to find solution in the challenges in Libya, we need to understand the security background in Libya. There are a number of challenges to building security in Libya. The remnants of the provision regime and also many Gaddafi supporters smuggled a large amount of money outside the country. Now they are using the money to disrupt the stability of the country in the transitional. Another challenge is building the army and security system because Gaddafi didn't leave any either the army or security institution functioning, and also they never functioned a way to promote the rule of law and human rights or protected the people of Libya. Another challenge is that 4 armed groups and revolutionary groups are now undertaking security function. They are operating under their own unit and command and not under the direction of the NTC or ministries. And the process of handing this rule back to civilian authorities is underway, but it's taking time. The current temporary government is incapable to providing security to the country from their perspective. Of providing security country from their perspective, they are waiting to legitimate election and the new constitution and a strong state before they give up the weapons. Others have felt the power of holding a weapon and don't want to give it up. The temporary government is having a hard time dealing with all these challenges, but there are positive steps that have been taken by the Ministry of Defense and Interior. An example in the plan of gathering the weapons after the war from militia and give them to national military. Also, the Libyan government has allocated a budget for 8 million Libyan dinars to train 200,000 recruits to become a soldier and policeman. The head of the fighters' affair body, Mustafa Sagisli, said that the main goal to train armed groups and give them the opportunity to join military or police and also to give them good salaries and benefits. Moving forward towards better security for the future, there are certain things that will help us. We do not have religious or ritual divides. We will need only what we are needing. We are needed patient, and we need cooperation between the government and the civil society. I don't think they can succeed without civil society cooperation. We also need a clear strategy in security to keep moving forward. Honestly, from my own experience as a woman and activist in the revolution from the first day, I never been threatened personally. Even though I appeared in the media from the first day until the liberation of the Tripoli, now in Benghazi, I feel very safe. I drive my car by myself daily. I live as a single woman with 2 daughters, and I don't have no problem. Political stability and personal security is what the Libyan people are hoping for. We hope to enjoy freedom and democracy under a political system where transparency is required. We have taken the first step, and we don't know we will be a long journey, but I believe it will be happen. We fought for our freedom and won as a Libyan, and as a Libyan, we should work hard to make sure we have security in Libya. Thank you for listening.
Hello, everybody. I made a presentation to show you pictures, but I'm just going to say it verbally. The military in Yemen is different. The military in Yemen is strongly linked to the tribal society. I guess it's present in a way, more or less, in the other armies in the other Arab Spring countries. But in Yemen, the tribal effect is very, very strong. So blood relations, family within the army, are key to sustaining power. During transition in Yemen, we have a clear roadmap fostered by regional forces, the GCC countries, as well as the international community. So in November, our president, the former president, signed the Gcc Agreement, and that made him step down from power. Now, the Gcc Agreement entails several things that's got to do with elections and with national dialogue, but most importantly, it entails establishing a military committee. And the military committee, they have a mandate to resolve divisions amongst the army and to relocate all soldiers back to camps, and their mandate now is to create stability in Yemen. But to understand the army in Yemen, we have to understand the family and tribal relations. The commissioner-in-chief is the president. And the former president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, he assigned his relatives in key institutions to ensure that he will be the most powerful. And if we look at his relatives in the military structure, we could easily notice that the closer the blood relation is to him, the stronger the military institution is. So his son, Ahmed Ali, he's been grooming him for a while. He is in control of the Republican Guards. And then he has three nephews responsible of Center Security, National Security, Special Forces, and distant relatives are more involved in the Army, Ministry of Defense, Air Force. So the further the blood relation, the less empowered the institution is, I would argue. So what happened during the revolution is that the distant relatives, they defected. Most primarily is the head of the Northern Army Division, Ali Mohsen al-Ahmar, and the Eastern Division of the Army. And these two then created a balance that allowed the revolution to succeed and have a back. Now, there are key institutions that I need to talk about very quickly. They are the Ministry of Defense, the Republican Guards, Special Forces, Central Security Forces, National Security, and Air Force. The Ministry of Defense, it has the higher command of the armed forces headed by Saleh, and the army and the revolution was successful enough to remove Saleh and we have another president, hooray, Abdurrabbu Mansour Hadi. And then below the commander-in-chief is the Ministry of Defense and the army. And as I said, it's divided by areas. So right now, military restructuring-wise, there are 4 areas: north, south, east, and west. The east and south had different loyalties. The east was loyal to the revolution. The south was loyal to Saleh. And during this phase of transition, the military committee was able to replace the heads of these 2 units to more neutral figures. So now we have more neutral figures, but we still have the northern area and the western area. Northern area is loyal to the revolution, Ali Mohsen, the main rival, and the western area is a pro-Saleh military leader. The Republican Guards are just as powerful as the army, and that was the dictator's way of maintaining power. It formerly was headed by Saleh's half-brother, but eventually he groomed his son enough to be in power, and he took the the Republican Guards. And the Republican Guards, they received a lot of training after 9/11 regarding counterterrorism. So they're well funded. They have a very large number, estimated to be equivalent to the regular army. They have state-of-art training, counterterrorism, SWAT teams, and things that you would see in the American army. And they're spread around the country. They're very sophisticated equipment. And unfortunately, during the revolution, they focused on cracking down the demonstrations. Now, the rival for Ahmed, who is the head of the Republican Guard, is the leader of the northern area. So in Yemen, it's basically family feud. And to be able to restructure the army, you have to figure out what are the dynamics. So if you take Ahmed, you cannot take Ahmed, the head of the Republican Guards, without taking down the head of the northern area, the rival, Ali Mohsen. And so it's basically really, really complicated dynamics. There's also the Center Security Forces. Center Security Forces have a very general mandate. In general, the security institutions in Yemen, they're not super specialized. They have overlap, they have intelligence on their own, and also like a force. So we're not really super specialized. But the Center Security Forces were the forefront of the anti-riot and crackdown of the protesters. And that also gives you another idea about how the family functions. So instead of putting Ahmed, the direct son, face-to-face with the revolution, let's put the nephew face-to-face with the revolution crackdown. And in human rights reports, both the Center Security Forces and the Republican Guards were mentioned as to have implemented excessive force against peaceful demonstrators, blocking protesters from accessing medical treatment, and collaboration with Baltajia and using people in civilian uniform to crack down the revolution. Again, the Center Security Forces received general funding for counterterrorism. They're very well equipped, and there are many counterterrorism units. There is a counterterrorism unit within Center Security, within the Republican Guards, and within the Ministry of Interior. So that's another challenge for us during transition, is how to integrate these under one leadership. I'll give you a couple of examples about how we were semi-successful or successful in removing some of the family members. And I'll talk specifically about the Air Force and the Special Forces. The Air Force is headed by Muhammad Saleh Al-Ahmar, and he is the half-brother of Ali Abdullah Saleh. He's been heading the Air Force since the unification in the 1990s, and basically feels it's his. So he refused. There were demonstrations against him to step down, and he refused. He was just stubborn, and he did not step down. And the president, the new president Hadi, issued a decree to ask him to step down, and he still refused, and he closed down the airport for a day or two. But how were we able to move past the stubbornness of the ruling family to remain in position? Was through international pressure. There was a GCC statement saying that GCC countries support President Hadi and support President Hadi's decrees. There was also Jamal bin Omar coming to the country, and eventually when Jamal bin Omar came to the country, they had a ceremony together when he said, okay, I let go, and okay, I don't want the Air Force. But without Jamal bin Omar, without the international force, we would have never been able to get rid of the Air Force. The second thing is what's happening these days is the Special Forces restructuring. So the regime learned the lesson from what happened with Tariq Saleh and decided, okay, so quickly, what are we going to do? We're going to take the head, because the institution does not matter. It's the person who is keeping the power, the person in the family that matters, that would keep the regime together. So they took the head of the Special Forces, assigned him. the head of the Republican Guard, the son of the president, gave him a decree to move to one of his brigades within the Republican Guards. So he moved to the brigade in the Republican Guard, and then that did not work well because we have a president. The head of the Republican Guards cannot give restructuring orders. So the president, Hadi, gave a decree asking the head of the Special Forces, Tariq, who's a nephew of the president, to step aside. And then he announced on TV that, yes, I abide by whatever the president said, but as a political maneuver, the deputy of his deputy refused. He said, I don't accept another leader because the new leader is just a media man and he does not understand. So in a way, the family is very resistant to change, and they maneuver in different ways to remain in power and reshuffle their people within the army and military security forces. Is it done? Okay, I'm just going to jump to the last bit. In Yemen, we need to find trusted neutral figures to head the military forces, especially regarding the counterterrorism units. We have to integrate the counterterrorism units under one unit, and this unit has to be directly linked to the new president so that we could weaken the relatives. And we have to, international community, I think at this point should show some teeth, because the family is finding other ways to strategize around the restructuring. So sanctions, assets freeze, they have to choose few people that could step down and, with asset freeze, so that they will be a role, that there will be a role model. So if you don't abide, this will happen to you too. Last thing is the international security should pressure the family and the opposition to carry on transitional justice to resolve grievances and feuds. And thank you.
Okay, the organizers brought to my attention that we're running a little bit behind schedule, so I promise to try to be as brief and as entertaining as I can possibly be. I should start off by thanking the U.S. Institute of Peace for this very kind invitation. I was asked by the organizers to introduce myself at the outset and tell you a little bit about what I do. I am a PhD candidate at Georgetown University in government, and actually my dissertation advisor is sitting right there, the second row, Daniel Brumberg. And over the duration of the past year, I've been based in Egypt, conducting my dissertation fieldwork, and all with the support of a very generous fellowship from USIP's Jennings-Randolph program. In addition to that, I also edit the Egypt page for an online magazine called Jadaliyya. And if you work on anything related to Middle East affairs and you don't know Jadaliyya just yet, you really are missing out. And finally, in the spirit of full disclosure, and in case it's not obvious to you just yet, I am Egyptian. But however, I'm not affiliated with any local political parties or movements or organizations in Egypt, and I only speak for myself. So with these disclaimers aside, let me say a few things about the topic of the panel today, security sector reform. And in particular, I'd like to focus on the broader political context that's shaping the prospects for advancing security sector reforms in Egypt. When we speak of an Egyptian revolution today, it becomes embarrassingly clear that the use of the term revolution in the context of Egypt is becoming more and more tenuous by the day. In February 2011, there was a very strong case to be made that what Egypt was going through was a full-fledged revolution. By March or April 2011, what was happening in Egypt looked less like a revolution, and it looked like Egypt was experiencing a transition that was being managed from above. And then by the fall of 2011, it became embarrassingly clear for most observers that Egypt is neither going through a revolution or even a transitional period, but looked more like a country that's living under military dictatorship. An unstable military dictatorship, a tenuous military dictatorship, and perhaps even a liberalizing military dictatorship, but a military dictatorship nonetheless. And the fact that until this day, people in Egypt still use the phrase, the demands of the revolution, matalib al-thawra, speaks to the harsh reality that those who have led the revolution in Egypt, the people who have led this revolution in Egypt, are not the people calling the shots in the country today. Because as we all know, revolutions, when they really happen, they don't make demands, they don't make requests, they actually make things happen, and they dictate the terms of the new political and social order, which is hardly what is happening in Egypt today. And the fact that we have to be gathered, I mean, let's face it, the fact that we actually gathered here today to talk about the reluctance of Egyptian authorities to advance something as fundamental as security sector reform does also partly speak to the problem at hand. The second point that I'd like to make is the fact that the emergence of competitive politics and an elected parliament in Egypt have not broken the SCAF's control over the political arena and have certainly not limited the ability of the SCAF to continue to manipulate this transition and this political process in order to shield its long-standing economic and political privileges from any elected civilian authority. For example, today in Egypt, we have an elected parliament, yet we still observe a consistent pattern of clampdowns against public expressions of political dissent through things like, at some point, emergency laws, military trials against civilians, the chronic use of deadly force by security forces against unarmed protesters, and, of course, the intimidation of political activists and their prosecution through on politically motivated charges. We have an elected parliament, and yet Mubarak's coercive apparatus remains intact and largely shielded from any meaningful security sector reform. What these realities have, a lot of people have observed this last year and have said that once we've got an elected parliament, these patterns will be broken and things will change. However, we do have an elected parliament today, yet very little has changed on that front. And very similarly, a lot of people say that once we've got an elected president, once we've got a new constitution in place, we're going to see a meaningful change. We're going to see a change we can believe in, and we all know how that turned out last time around. However, for most observers, I think it has become embarrassingly clear that Egypt is being steered closer and closer towards a political system in which competitive politics and elected officials will have very little bearing over the fundamental workings of key executive bureaucracies, particularly the executive bureaucracies that could potentially challenge the military's political and economic interests. And by these executive bureaucracies, I'm referring to what is often dubbed the sovereign ministries, or wazarat al-siyadiyya, such as the ministries of defense, interior, foreign affairs, Ministry of Finance, and various governmental bodies engaged in economic policy making. And you can probably add to this list the Ministry of Information and state-owned media. So what these realities have done is that they have convinced many activists on the ground in Egypt that the most pressing and most fundamental challenge that is facing advocates of transformative change in Egypt today is not attaining free and fair elections, is not electing a new parliament, a new president, or placing or putting a new constitution in place, but it's rather giving all those institutions depth and meaning. And by giving them depth and meaning, I'm talking about taming those unaccountable centers of power, centers of powers inside the state, those unaccountable bureaucracies that I was referring to earlier, making them more transparent, making them more subservient and more accountable to an elected civilian leadership, and making them more responsive to public demands and public needs. In other words, the real challenge is actually bringing the revolution into key areas of the executive branch in Egypt. And within this context, I think security sector reform should be viewed as the epicenter of the struggle to bring to Egyptian bureaucracies the actual revolution, to introduce the revolution into the Egyptian bureaucracies. Particularly when we're talking about reforms that seek to subordinate military leaders and institutions to elected civilian authorities, and reforms that seek to ensure that the military establishment is engaged exclusively in its natural and conventional mission of national defense, not engaged in things like managing the political arena, like the SCAF is doing right now, or engaged in things like managing the huge and vast economic empire that the military currently owns in Egypt. And of course, of equal importance, just as my colleague Magda outlined in her presentation earlier today, of equal importance, of course, are the types of reforms that seek to change and transform Mubarak's coercive apparatus into a politically neutral, transparent, and accountable law enforcement body that provides for all Egyptians' human security, while, of course, respecting the rule of law and human rights. So, left to their own devices, military leaders who are currently calling the shots in Egypt, the bureaucrats or their allies inside the bureaucracy, and to some extent also the elected politicians, left to their own devices, they may not be naturally predisposed or naturally inclined to move forward on these reforms swiftly or decisively. And that is because from the perspective of the SCAF, any kind of civilian encroachment against these executive bureaucracies will probably compromise its long-term ability to be able to secure and protect its political and economic privileges. And from the perspective of some elected politicians, trying to institute full accountability and full transparency against military leaders will probably threaten the SCAF so much and probably prompt some military leaders to try to overturn this whole political process and saying, I'm not playing this game anymore, which would eventually result in those politicians losing the valuable political and electoral gains that they have scored in the course of the past year. In other words, at the elite level, there may be this tentative, formative, anti-reform consensus that's emerging. Nonetheless, I think the most important and most fundamental wild card in this whole equation is popular pressure from below, led by protest movements, led by civil society initiatives that seek to force the bureaucrats, the military leaders, and the politicians out of their comfort zone and seek to pressure them into adopting the type of deep institutional reforms that speak to the goals and objectives of this revolution, the type of deep institutional reforms that could give this revolution in Egypt depth and permanence, like security sector reform. So this is all what I have to say for now. I look forward to your questions during the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all the members of our panel for very insightful, very individualist, very candid presentations. We now want to engage the audience. We'd like to take your questions. The way we're going to do this is when you came in, you were handed two cards, a card for this panel and a card for the second panel. If you would please write a question on the card and pass the card down the line to the closest aisle. We have two monitors, Steph and Stu, which I think is the name of a new sitcom or something, anyway. But Stu and Steph, and they will pick up the cards and bring them up to the stage. If you didn't raise a card or didn't receive cards when you came in, raise your hand, we'll get you cards. But please write down your questions and pass them along. As we're waiting for cards to be collected, I want to exercise my prerogative as the chair and to ask a question of the entire panel. Okay? The question is, and it's a simple question, but it's a profound question, I hope, and that is when you all talk to your friends and your families, what are their concerns? What are their concerns about their personal safety? What are their concerns about the security of their country? And what do they want to see changed?
I'd say in Egypt the concern is personal safety. And this is something that we've been seeing for the past year and a half, that people feel very insecure in the streets. Although crime rates might not have risen to crazy levels, but the feelings of insecurity are very strong. and the fear of instability, I would say, is the second thing. Although many Egyptians hope for real change, they are really worried that real change would come with a lot of instability, and this is something that they've been living for the past year and a half, and they're tired of it, instability in security matters, but also instability in economic matters, and this is starting to be difficult on people.
Thank you. Radwan?
I think there are two main concerns that you hear from Tunisians today. First one is the social economic situation, especially unemployment and the youth. As you know, we have large number of college graduates who are unemployed. So that's the main concern. And then the second concern is the feeling that the pro-Ben Ali forces, the counter-revolutionary forces, are organizing themselves and trying to foil the transition or derail the transition to democracy in Tunisia and make it look like, you know, things were better under Ben Ali.
It is the fear of retribution. When I get on TV, sometimes later I get a call from Damascus to tell me to zip it. Fear of retribution. Another fear, increasingly so, is personal security, because now there are bombs going off in Damascus, my hometown. And third, and this is truly not the least, but prices are skyrocketing. And now there are real concerns about the availability of basics, medicine, food, and so on.
In Sana'a, it's a lot better, and in the major cities in Yemen, because the military committee has done a lot of work on disarmament, removing checkpoints, so it's a lot easier to walk about. In the past, last year, there were areas, especially around the Change Square, where when you walk, you know that maybe there's a sniper around, because there was a few incidents of people dying from snipers around the Change Square. But now it's a lot better. It's still not ideal. We still fear assassinations, fear of personal security, as well as mukhabarat, this boogeyman that keeps, or big brother that listens to all of us. So if I'm talking on the phone to another revolutionary and we're talking really sensitive issues, I'd be saying, okay, I gotta get off the phone, the national security is probably listening. But other than that, it's getting better.
Thank you. And Nigel?
The main concern in Libya is the weapons and also the militian groups, because as I mentioned in my speech, there's some militian groups, they are refused to join to the military. So the concern, how they are dealing now with the weapons, especially in the cities, and we saw this problem maybe in the east area, at least 100%, but in the west it's more complicated, and this has belonged to the history, and who have the loyalty of Gaddafi, they are based in this area, so it's very difficult and complicated. There's efforts to collect these weapons. We have some process, but we still have the concern from this problem.
Okay, we have a question. In some transition countries, revolutionary fighters are proud of their role in toppling the repressive regime. However, they have been cautious or reluctant to join new national institutions, both security forces and political institutions, for fear of losing their credibility. How do you address this concern, a situation where people are proud of what they've done in the past, but suspicious and reluctant to join in the reformed institutions for the future? No, it's okay. Just speak. Just speak.
Well, I mean, in the context, I mean, the question may be more pertinent to some of the other cases, but certainly, some aspects of the question are relevant in the case of Egypt, not necessarily with respect to joining, the security sector, since we did not have the type of militias throughout the course of the revolutions that we saw in other countries. You certainly saw a huge presence of various criminal networks that were contracted by the Ministry of Interior. One of the many virtues of or the many signs of privatization in Egypt, I guess, privatizing repression and thuggery. But I think there is something to be said about the fact that many people who are engaged in various protest movements in Egypt are very reluctant to, certainly very proud of what they've done throughout the 18-day uprisings and the challenges and confrontations that followed. However, there is a great deal, of discrepancy across different people's commitment or willingness to join the ongoing political process, or more specifically the SCAF-managed political process, and to take part in a process that is essentially managed and dictated by the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, and lending that process legitimacy. On the other hand, you do see a lot of people who would like to take part in this process and play by these games, hoping that playing by these games will eventually lead to sort of reforming the system from within. So you definitely observe this on some level in Egypt.
I mean, there's a number of questions that are coming from the audience that all speak to the same theme, and the theme really is what can outsiders do to help? What is the role that the international community, donor governments, friends can play? And we'll let Radwan start.
I think in the case of Tunisia, Tunisia is making good progress on the political front, also on the security front. I mean, obviously, as I said, it's difficult, it's challenging, and it will take time. But I think we're making good progress on those fronts. And really what I think is most needed is economic assistance to stabilize the economy. As some people mentioned here, prices have gone up. Jobs have not increased. So there is a feeling among young people especially, but among a lot of people, that the economic situation is in trouble. We lost a lot of money due to tourism last year, and also this year. The phosphate industry also lost a lot of money, some closures in industries and factories and things like that. So I think really stabilizing the economy to give time to the transition period. As we know, transition period takes a few years at least. So really the economic assistance is what's most needed, I think, in the case of Tunisia.
Okay.
Libya, it's a rich country, even we don't have money now, it's outside the country, but really, before the revolution, we was a closed country, don't have the opportunity to engage with international community. And this is the reason behind, a lot of gap, especially in the knowledge and the skills in the Libyan people. So actually from the international organization, and I recognize this when I deal with the participant in several workshops, they are very hungry to exchange information and to provide their skills and to know more about many topics and how they can deal, especially in the transitional period. And what we did, actually, the United States, they did an amazing job in the ground, because really they bring some expertise from different countries who are suffering from the transitional period, to have some lessons to learn and avoid the negative things and try to learn from the positive things. And this is support the people to understand, the background of the transitional period, because one of the main reasons, actually, the people, they have very high expectation. They did a lot for this revolution. There's a lot of people, they are dead, and then now they accept the change that will happen in 1 year or 2 years. So when they are understanding the challenges and how they can deal through this, actually it's going to be a big benefit and good support from the international organization.
Thanks very much. There's a number of questions that go to the issue of intelligence services and the Muhabarat, and how this institution, which is pervasive throughout the region, can be dealt with. And I'd like to ask a couple of people to respond. I'd like to ask Morhaf and then Magda.
I'll respond only on the condition that I can respond to the previous question. It's an important question for Syria. As you know, there is the Annan plan, the 6-point plan of Mr. Kofi Annan, who I personally view as being dead even before arrival. There is this plan to maintain the ceasefire in Syria, but there is no ceasefire to maintain. It has no deadline, nor does it give the Assad regime any consequences if it fails, and it is clearly failing. There needs to be some international teeth to back this plan. The Assad regime needs to know that it has to implement, not selectively, but all the points. And if it doesn't, it's going to be whacked. There needs to be the threat of the use of force. When a US senator, I don't want to name him, went on TV one day to use the word air power, the same day there were 4 Syrian generals that defected. The same day the Syrian pound went from 50 to the dollar to 103 to the dollar. There needs to be the establishment of a safe haven, of a safe zone that people can go to. And if they are harassed by the regime, they will be whacked. There needs to be the threat of the use of force. Syrians inside and outside do not want any foreign boots on the ground. What is asked for is not a massive military intervention on the part of the international community. But when Mr. Assad hears from people like Mr. Rasmussen, the Secretary General of NATO, that NATO will never use force, will never entertain the use of force, not even if it's mandated by the Security Council, then Mr. Assad can go on in the savagery with which he is going on.
I think what I'll do is I'll just ask you to answer the question that I ask. The question was, what about the intelligence services? And how do we deal with the Mukhabarat in countries? And we'll just use Egypt. We're just about out of time, so we'll take this question and then we'll move on. Thanks.
Okay. This is a very difficult question because the intelligence services are the one part of the security sector that nobody knows anything about really in depth. It has a history of being very secretive until the last person who was head of the Mukhabarat, Omar Suleiman. Nobody even knew the name of the head of the General Intelligence Agency. He was the first one that we knew the name of after having held office for many years. There's one intelligence agency, the one that was part of the Ministry of the Interior, the Amn al-Dawla State Security Investigations Agency, the one that changed the name. This is the only one that has had some kind of work done on. A few weeks into Mubarak stepping down, revolutionaries stormed the headquarters of the State Security Investigations, got many documents out, and this is when the Ministry of Interior had to at least pretend that, okay, we will change, the name has changed, the leaders have changed, and we will no longer be involved in torture, in detention, and in brutal interrogations. While there is very little information on how much change actually happens, we are still seeing the same practices. We don't know whether these practices come from state security investigations or from the Mukhabarat, from the General Intelligence Agency, or sometimes from the Military Intelligence Agency. But the same practices keep happening. Activists coming are stopped at the airport, interrogated at the airport sometimes. There are arrests of political activists who are later on released. There is still involvement of intelligence services in appointments, in important appointments in the country. And this is one of the main dark areas of security sector in Egypt. It's one of the things that we still haven't managed to break through. And if I may come back to the question before, what can the international community do? I would really say when negotiating anything with the Egyptian government, whether it's aid, whether it's grants, whether it's loans, you always have to insist on accountability. This is the one thing that cannot be negotiated. Accountability of the security agencies, accountability of intelligence services, accountability of the army, of the police. This is the one thing I think that should not, the threshold that you should never go under.